This video is sponsored by 80,000 Hours.
There is no doubt that Meyer's work speaks to women, and that her novels open a window into the minds and emotions of millions of girls, representing through her tale of vampires, werewolves, and teenagers, something of the lives and wishes of girls today. Ultimately, any feminist critic hopes that female readers are canny enough to allow themselves to swoon into Meyer's fantasy of everlasting passion and devotion, and at the same time become heroes in their own lives. I want to give a special thank you to everyone on Patreon who helped make this video possible. We have 1 goal down, 3 more to go, but no matter which one we hit, I'm just so thankful for you. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy. If you've been following me for a long time, you know I started on this channel 16-ish years ago being an anti-Twilight person. I hated the books for mostly pick-me reasons that were eventually elevated because there are very valid reasons to dislike the series. The writing, the racism, gender issues, etc. At the same time, the series has been ongoing a renaissance, one that has been trying to reconcile the fact that Twilight's criticism, while valid, also had a tint of misogyny in it because of how popular it was with teenagers and young women. And moms.
How long is it going to be before you actually get to see the panel?
Well, let's see. 8 tomorrow morning is 24 hours, plus 4 more hours, about 28 hours.
The exploration of the sexism surrounding the anti-Twilight mainstream discourse was and is important and necessary. The valid criticisms of Twilight, while they always existed, were often belied and overshadowed by gay jokes, jokes about women being stupid, and a disdain for it seeming to ruin vampires in fiction.
You're beautiful.
Beautiful. This is the skin of the killer, bro.
At the same time, there is something that's come out of this reassessment, a desire to respond to all criticism, all looks at introspection at series that are targeted towards women and young girls with a sort of like empty-headedness, it's okay to not have to critically think about this at all. And unfortunately, just enjoy things has become a way to just put to the side all the things about a work that is rightfully problematic. And let me be clear, I do understand that if you have put in your hours of understanding a discourse and simply want to enjoy something in peace, as most people do, you will continue to do so. This video is not going to be for you because you realize that just because it's a form of entertainment and you enjoy it does not mean it is above reproach. And if you don't want to engage in that conversation, you just scroll. However, in the face of boycotts, genocide, conversations about race, rape culture, etc., it's important to not allow your feelings of entertainment to center larger conversations when this is brought up. For example, when you tell Sarah J. Maas fans that you find the fact that she posted about Breonna Taylor's murder in a cover reveal, no matter what her intent may have been, that as Black readers, or just Black people in general, we are allowed to feel uncomfortable about that. You may like the books, you may be a Black reader who enjoys Sarah J. Maas, but it's important to understand that this conversation and the disdain that people may feel towards her because of that is a valid one, and built upon not just that statement. In her previous Throne of Glass series, she killed off the primary Black character in the second work to advance a white character storyline, therefore not really giving her any grace to do such a comment and have it be perceived in good faith. Now, does that mean I dislike Sarah J. Maas? No, I've read a lot of her work, which is why I know that she killed off that Black character. And so these criticisms are not meant to erase your enjoyment. They are meant to illuminate you that there's a perspective beyond your own. As someone who's on Book Talk and looks at a lot of stuff being made there, I think it's very evident that a lot of people who were at one point Twilight fans have become writers, and that some of them have not really sat with the issues that were key to that series and are perpetuating a lot of the same tropes and issues that were present there, because that formula worked and is now, in years following, has only proven to have staying power for audiences who do not care about the many valid criticisms of Twilight, because they are able to either just nostalgize it or put it into that lump of misogyny criticism that we were talking about earlier. When I put this as a Patreon goal, it was not simply to just do an easy layup about Twilight. However, even saying that, I found myself surprised at how it felt to reread these books, not only because it was the first time in over a decade that I read all 4 books, but also just sitting very clear-eyed in the totality of how mediocre the books are writing-wise, but how deeply misogynistic and racist the text is, while still being popular enough to get a color pop line in 2024. And it's very clear on the page, and I've printed out a lot of text because I did read all 4 of them in a very short period of time, that it's there. It's very clear, and I think that you don't need to make things up about Twilight to show why it's bad. Many of my colleagues have in the past few years revisited and discussed Twilight, attempting to cut through the sexism that was very much at the forefront of the discourse to understand its popularity. Because as popular as it was, Twilight was never respected. Profitable, but somewhat shameful, especially as it kept going on. There was important work in addressing the way in which people dealt with their anti-Twilight sentiment. And again, I speak from experience. Part of revisiting this series was to come face to face with my own growth as a reader, a feminist, and as a hottie who enjoys trash, while also overthinking. Combine that with the white feminism discourse around Barbie and the way in which book talk is constantly dealing with race issues in their many different romance categories, and what was initially gonna be a look at Twilight and women grew into, well, what you're watching here today.
Eat a Snickers. Why? Because you get a little angry when you're hungry.
You may not be an immortal vampire, but you do have 80,000 hours to figure out what you want to do with your life. As someone who has struggled to figure out their own path, even while doing this for a really long period of time, it can be hard to figure out how to make the best impact with your world, how to do something that really makes a difference. And we are living in a time where careers and job opportunities just feel harder and harder every day to get through it. But thankfully with our sponsor, you can access their full range of research, information in order to find the jobs that mean the most to you. They also host a job board with nearly 1,000 current open high-impact career opportunities, and they offer one-on-one advice to help you switch paths from wherever you are now to wherever you want to go. There's also the 80,000 Hours podcast, which usually hosts in-depth conversations with experts about how best to tackle pressing global problems. You can go to my custom link here to be sent a free copy of their in-depth career guide, which aims to help you learn what makes for a higher impact career, get new ideas for impactful paths, and make a new plan based on what you've learned to put it into an action. Thank you to 80,000 Hours for sponsoring this video. You can't always get the vampire of your dreams, but you can get the career of your dreams.
Twilight was published in 2005 and launched first-time writer Stephenie Meyer into superstardom. Originally meant to be a standalone series, it went on to include 3 sequels and a gender-bent spin-off, all of which I have read. However, I realized while I was doing this right now, I haven't read Midnight Sun, which I forgot came out. So if this video gets, let's say, 200,000 views in the first 7 days, myself and my friend Chase, aka Mana Curves, will do a Midnight Sun book club and raise some money. It also was the basis for a fan fiction that would become the 50 Shades of Grey series, a trend that has validated the ability of all kinds of fan fiction to not just be published, but hyper successful at making the romance section as white as possible. Because when all of them are publishing their very white het ships, you get a lot of white het content. This series is about a teenage girl named Bella who falls in love with the vampire Edward Cullen and his extended vampire family. The vampires attempt to hide their existence from other humans while also protecting Bella from other vampires. They have also decided to live in the same territory as their natural enemies, the Quileute shifters, who are werewolves but not technically werewolves, they're technically shifters, but they have a treaty and it's okay.
My great-grandfather, the chief, found them hunting on our land.
Twilight is almost infamously known for having no plot, and I gotta say, the movies do a really good job of taking the little bit of stakes that happen at the very end of each book and divvying it up throughout the work. I think what's really interesting about Twilight is that there is no conflict for the majority of the book, and then all of a sudden, boom, the other vampires arrive, and then we have to have Bella run around and traumatize her father and almost get bitten. It's very meandering in that regard. In the second book is when we get introduced properly to the Quileute shifters, where we're introduced to the Volturi, who are kind of the royalty of the vampire community and really operate to maintain the secrecy of vampires. Eclipse is when Victoria, who is the main villain, who's upset at Bella because her mate was killed because he tried to kill Bella and Edward killed him, and so she's mad about it. She's cool on paper but doesn't really do anything. And then the fourth book is about Bella having a baby, and then people thinking that that baby is evil, but then the baby is not evil, and then everything's okay. Now, mind you, I don't think that every series needs to have a blood count. In fact, having just recently rewatched all of the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition, I realized that the body count in that series is very low. Shout out to Boromir, who is our fallen king. However, that death is there to give stakes, to give heart, to be an emotional crux of that first film. And we want our cast to live, but importantly, even though they survive, you feel like they could die at any time. The stakes are consistent, and therefore the tension is already there. With Twilight, the main conflict is, will Bella get to have her vampire boyfriend? The stakes are so low, they have apple-bottom jeans and boots with the furs. It was with the film adaptation that the series went on to become a $5.8 billion success for Summit Entertainment and fully launched the careers of several actors who have gone on to do much better things. Twilight has been, in my opinion, a double-edged sword for everyone involved, including Stephenie Meyer, who has not made a successful series since, for Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart. It's also been a massive albatross on them for certain reasons, always brought up when they're doing any kind of performance. And I think their ability to even act was always called into question for a degree, more so Kristen Stewart because of sexism, because they were in these movies. But it was a work that meant a lot to audiences, and because it was so profitable, a lot of people would make their own sort of like rip-offs of Twilight with angels, with wolves, with the Fae, all reproducing the same heteronormative, toxic, cis relationships that were present in this one. In my mind, while I could get into the writing, I think that bad writing is sort of like its own animal, and I think that you can enjoy something that's poorly written and that's very subjective to people.
First it's the spelling and the grammar.
What I will say are the biggest issues with Twilight, and will be the focus on this video, will be gender and race. When I first went to outline this script, I was going to explore each female character as they are depicted in the books. But despite the thousands of pages I read, the reality is most characters in this series are flatter than a high top. Even characters I thought had more development, like Alice, were very different and flatter in the text. A lot of the personality people are seeing comes from the films, and the actors bringing a bit more something. To say that the women in Twilight are underwritten is putting it mildly, and also most characters in Twilight are underwritten. Each female character operates as a certain archetype, or, you know, a placeholder for a type of femininity, but there isn't much more to it. Putting Bella aside, the most important recurring female characters are Alice, Esme, Angela, Leah, Rosalie, and Victoria.
What is that god-awful wet dog smell?
Despite being considered by the fandom cute and quirky, all Alice does is give Bella makeovers and talk about putting on parties and clothes. The only thing interesting about Alice are her powers and her pixie cut. Despite the criticism of Rosalie that Rosalie is vain, I think Alice is just as, if not more, materialistic on the page. She's always talking about her cars and her clothes and fixing up Bella. It's very superficial and capitalistic, which the entire series is very hyper capitalistic. One of the things that's really interesting about the illustrated guide, they have a section all about their cars. Like, this is the vampire series about, like, you know, the idea of a soul and eternal love, and you have a whole section about, like, what car do they all drive. It's like, it's very shallow.
Now that you're my sister, you'll have to get over your aversion to fashion.
Her powers are also constantly being retooled to give her gaps because otherwise she'd be too powerful. The result is that she's always kind of like either not on the page because she knows too much, or there has to be some weird reason why her powers do not work, which creates its own sort of like plot holes. They say in Eclipse that shifters and werewolves are essentially too wild and chaotic, so Alice can't predict anything around them, which is silly and makes no sense because it is established that they have human minds because they communicate to each other, and also the vampires are just as ruled by their emotions, so the fact that the werewolves are too wild is very like super sus. But I'll get into that. Also, she's married to a Confederate soldier, so you know, not all is going well with Alice.
Bella, we're making Italiano for you.
Oh.
Bella, this is Esme, my mother for all intents and purposes.
Esme and also Renesmee, they are non-characters. They are simply two kinds of mother archetypes, with Esme being the traditional kind of mother who builds this family unit with Carlisle and sort of is the proper, giving, all-nurturing mother. In Anna Silver's article, Twilight is not good for maidens, gender, sexuality, and the family in Stephenie Meyer's Twilight, she makes the implication that Bella is inappropriately mothered, almost in a Rory Gilmore-like way, and Renee in that thing would be like a less competent Lorelai. And it's always mentioned how flighty Renee is, how Bella had to raise herself. When Renee is talking to Bella about getting married young, she says about how Bella has never been young and never been a child, and therefore, you know, her getting married at 18 is super normal and okay because, like, of course she would.
Just want to make sure you're making the right choices for you. You know, because you're the one that's going to have to live with them.
And it's just a validation for her choices and also a way of showing how Bella is the ultimate mother when she is willing to sacrifice everything, including her own existence, to have Renesmee in Breaking Dawn.
I think Bella's gonna be showing.
Jess, she is not pregnant.
Okay. Who else gets married at 18?
Angela and Jessica, to kind of throw in here, are the closest things Bella has to human friends. Jessica is just kind of the meaner friend who Bella hangs out with in New Moon because she thinks that Jessica is self-absorbed and won't ask questions. She's played by Anna Kendrick in the film, who absolutely adds more to the role by just being Anna Kendrick, and technically she's playing a combination of two characters, Laura and Jessica, so like having two mediocre characters combined makes her like more than just a regular character.
It's supposed to be a metaphor for consumerism, because don't be so pleased with your own, like, self-referential cleverness, you know?
But Angela is the good friend. She's not a gossip. She's, you know, not jealous of Bella. She doesn't ask real questions. The only nice thing that Bella does the entire series without, like, any real reason for doing it is helping Angela do some like cards for an event, and even then it is a way to show Charlie that she can hang out with people who aren't named Cullen. She's a bad friend. Then we have Rosalie. Rosalie was always my favorite character because her frustration and concern about Bella's presence in the family was always quite valid.
Let's just keep pretending like this isn't dangerous for all of us.
Bella is accident prone and Jasper is still adjusting to their non-human blood lifestyle. If anything were to happen, they'd all be in trouble for exposure. She's also the only one in the family who's never had human blood, so she also has probably the biggest ability to be resistant, but knows how everyone else isn't. Emmett has previously harmed two women who he felt a blood pull towards. We see in New Moon that Jasper tries to attack Bella when she gets a paper cut. So her concern about how this could be bad for everyone is not born of nothing. It is an actual concern about having a human in the family and no real motivation to turn her as of yet. Because if you turn her while she's this young, that's also going to be a problem. So it just creates more anxiety for the entire family, which she is the only one who feels it because she's blonde and she's bad. Despite this very clear logic, she's often depicted as being petty. Even in the Twilight film, there were a few moments done to add antagonism that were actually there.
Rosalie, Esme, could you put these on so the tracker will pick up Bella's scent?
Why? What is she to me?
And she's blamed for things that are not her fault. Like in New Moon, when she tells Edward that Bella has died, it's treated as Rosalie's fault when Alice is the one who had the vision and did not contact anyone to clarify it wasn't true. How is she supposed to know when everyone hyper relies on Alice's visions in the first place? It's ridiculous. When she confesses to Bella her backstory of being beautiful and vain and rich, but that is gang raped to death before becoming a vampire, it just feels, I always hated this part because it's a badass thing in terms of her being able to get revenge on her ex-fiance, but the way that she talks about herself in the text is just so hateful towards herself. I printed all this stuff out, let me use it. It took some time before I began to blame the beauty for what had happened to me, for me to see the curse of it, to wish that I'd been, well, not ugly, but normal, like Vera, so I could have been allowed to marry someone who loved me and have pretty babies. That's what I'd really wanted all along. It still doesn't seem like too much to have asked for. This is how she's talking about the trauma of being assaulted, and it's about her being so beautiful and about her being just so selfish and so vain, and she learned her lesson, but she learned it too late. That's sexist. That's misogyny. Why is her being beautiful and being aware of that and being assaulted tied together? Being beautiful and being attractive is not why women or anyone is assaulted. Rape is about power, and by tying her assault with her beauty reinforces so many negative stereotypes about sexual assault, and I just feel like it's just so gross. Now you might say the whole like humbling herself thing, that's me reading into it, but hold on. Right after she tells Bella about this tragic backstory, they have this tete-a-tete, and Rosalie confesses that she was jealous of Bella because, not just because she's human, just because she can have access to certain things about her body that she may want, but because, you see, at first, I was mostly jealous because he, Edward, wanted you and not me. Why? She's happily married to Emmett. They're apparently screwing so much they ruin houses. She has no real interest in Edward, although she was created to be a potential mate for Edward, but he hates blondes, so whatever. It's done to constantly reduce her to the wrong kind of woman, inherently vain and selfish at her core, and it's so transparent. Even when in Breaking Dawn, where she's probably Bella's strongest advocate for her own choice, it's always treated as like Rosalie has alternative motives. She's gonna steal the baby. She's just this horrible, dumb, stupid blonde. Like the blonde jokes in Breaking Dawn, it's pages of them. It happens at 4 to 5 times, and I was like, Stephenie, who hurt you? Like, there's absolutely no reason why I should be reading in the middle of this really intense moment where your main female character might die from giving birth, and you're just giving me blonde joke after blonde joke after blonde joke and dog joke after dog joke. What?
Why did he have to butt in? I could have taken that tip.
I'll give it a rest, Leah.
No!
Leah Clearwater is very similar to Rosalie. They serve the same kind of like, I'm considered the mean girl even though I'm the realest bitch out here situation, except Leah is Quileute, and I gotta say, probably one of the strongest characters in all fiction, because if I had gone through what she had, I would be a super villain. I would be burning shit down. You know how like in The Killing Joke, there's the whole thing of like, it's one bad day? Like, Leah has had that one bad day and is still not eating people alive, and I don't have that strength. Throughout the course of the story, in less than a 2-year window of time, Leah's father dies. Her boyfriend ghosts her, comes back, and then falls in love with her cousin because of supernatural magic. She becomes the only female werewolf, which means, for some reason, that she is infertile. And because all of the wolves are mentally linked by the pack, she can hear how much her ex-boyfriend is in love with her cousin, and any time she feels grief or anger or bitterness, as they call it, she is depicted as being whiny. And while Bella has a modicum of empathy for her, it is quickly like shot down by literally everybody else. And I cannot imagine why. And when she finally builds some kind of camaraderie with Jacob, who have both been screwed over by the idea of mating and true love, he falls in love with a newborn.
Look,
I'll stay out of your way. I'll do whatever you want, except go back to Sam's pack and be the pathetic ex-girlfriend he can't get away from.
Leah being treated with so little empathy about her heartbreak is so galling, especially because in New Moon, it is an entire literal heartbreak book about someone Bella dated for around 7 months, that she spends literally months in a comatose state and then spends the entire book getting into near-death occasions and like gaslighting Jacob, although he should have taken the hint a long time ago.
Don't make me choose. Because it'll be him. It's always been him.
Yet Leah being left by her high school sweetheart, who she was dating for years, for her own cousin, is not seen as worthy of angst. Why is that? Because imprinting is just this perfect thing that we shouldn't question. It's just totally great all the time because it's destiny. And that is just so ridiculous. Even Jacob, who is thirsting after Bella like someone who's never seen a white girl with dark hair before, is moping constantly about his pain over a girl who never, and I emphasize, who never seriously wanted him. When you look at the totality of female characters in Twilight, their motivations, their characterizations, you can see a collection of mostly shallow, vain, underwritten characters who either have no goals or want to have babies as their only goal and they can't achieve that. And their lives largely revolve around men. Even Victoria, the major antagonist for 2 books, doesn't speak. Across the entire saga, she has maybe a single line of dialogue altogether across all the books. And why is she the villain? Because Edward killed her mate and she wants revenge. That's it. Is there any attempt at pathos or even a whiff of nuance? Nope. She's just a crazy redhead who's very fast, and that's it. In Twilight's heteronormative reversal of the Monstrous, Utopia, and the Gothic design by Kelly Budruweit, she says, in the Gothic of Twilight, the most abject and frightening situation is one in which a woman has no love relationship. Twilight is a deeply sexist book series teetering on wholesale misogyny, except it is not competent enough to do so. To go back to the defenses about the feminism in Twilight, I feel like it's so centered on the flimsiest idea of what feminism is, which is that feminism is about the women's ability to have choices. In my mind, the second worst definition of feminism behind feminism is the radical idea that women are people. Like, thank you for that. It fits well on a t-shirt. That's not actually what we're talking about here. To quote from the previous article again, emphasis on Bella's choice is undermined by the continuous insistence that she wants traditional structures without knowing it. Bella's choices undermine whatever feminist narrative they want to present because the reality is that she's making conservative choices all the time without any look at her own goals.
This wasn't a choice between you and Jacob. It was between who I should be and who I am. I've always felt out of step.
You sure about that?
At my big age, I do understand the appeal of Bella Swan to teenagers, but also to people who want to fall in love. There is something emotionally gripping about the idea of someone who falls madly in love with you and would do anything to protect you. Bella is wiser than her years on paper and is looking to find a purpose, and the perfect lover and family fall into her lap with almost no work on her part except being kind of selfless one time to like help out her mom. And like, yeah, it is very trad wife wish fulfillment in a fantasy series. And also, even her being an audience avatar, many characters are written to be an audience avatar or an author stand-in. It is not inherently a bad thing. You want a character to be relatable. Jon Snow is an author's avatar. Bella's problem is that even within that framework, she's an obnoxious, petty, shallow, manipulative fool who has no real desires other than to be with Edward and fears being over the age of 18 more than death itself.
Oh, your birth is definitely something to celebrate.
My aging is not.
You're aging.
Not being proactive is fine, but that doesn't mean you should just be in the orbit of a man. Yes, it's a Bildungsroman, which is a traditional coming-of-age story, but Jane Eyre has other ambitions besides being with Mr. Rochester. This idea that because it's a romance, because it's a Bildungsroman, means that she's allowed to be a non-entity, to be to be a mediocre person is very reductive to not only books for young girls and women, but to romance authors who put in the work of making these fully developed characters. Anyana Mukherjee, which I apologize if I said that wrong, points out the appeal of vampire boyfriends, that they are gentlemen. And Edward is situated to be sort of like a benevolent paternal character. Of course, there's also a veneer of whiteness that plays into role with that. Where do native characters fit into that kind of benevolent paternalism when the signifiers of that paternal gentleman are stuff being done with capitalism and white privilege, which the Cullens do have? And so many of the counter arguments about how Bella is feminist actually is around the idea that she has choices, that she chooses to be a vampire, that she wants to have sex, that she doesn't want to get married young, and that ultimately the entire series is about her going from pawn to queen in her little vampire family. Stephenie Meyer once said in defense of Bella, "We can't all be slayers." But Buffy in herself was a groundbreaking character because of how she flipped on the archetype of the blonde character in a horror movie. That's why Buffy is relevant, not just because she is a woman who is strong, she's also very sensitive and I would say as romantically inclined as a Bella Swan. And it's very reductive to think there's only two kinds of characters, girls who do nothing and girls who save the world. There's a lot of in-between girls who are doing things just fine. Suggesting that Bella's arc is feminist because she becomes a queen is a very, very shallow reading of the story. But I even could give it maybe a dash of a point, if not for how her pregnancy storyline plays out in Breaking Dawn. So for those of you who don't know, Bella wants to have sex as a human because she is concerned that if she becomes a vampire after she gets married to Edward at his insistence, because she doesn't want to get married, but she decides to marry him because it's the only way that they can be intimate, even though at the end of Eclipse he was like, well, do you want it? And she's like, no. And again, just to point this out, yes, she makes a choice, but what does it ultimately say? That it's always the conservative values that end up being what's done. But anyway, so she wants to be human so she can have sex with Edward while she's human, so she can not be consumed by bloodlust. They don't know that she's gonna be a super vampire, not have bloodlust at the time. So Edward is nervous about it because he's afraid that he will hurt her during sex. Turns out she's into that. Relatable. So they have sex consistently without killing Bella, and so Bella decides, instead of just becoming a vampire right away, that she's actually gonna go to Dartmouth. She's gonna go to school. She's actually gonna live some more of her human life instead of just becoming a vampire right away, and then instantly she gets pregnant with Renesmee. It's almost like it's a worse version of Lane from Gilmore Girls, where Lane gets pregnant one time after having sex one time, and it's terrible sex anyway.
I barely got to do it, Zach. I barely got the chance to be a person.
I think everything about the pregnancy is violently anti-choice, but not just because she decides to keep the baby. That is her right. And I know that there are people who would want to keep a child even if it was potentially fatal to themselves. It is the language that is used, the visuals, but also what Meyer is implying about vampire women who cannot become pregnant. She says, of course Rosalie could not conceive a child because she was frozen in the state in which she passed from human to inhuman, totally unchanging. And human women bodies had to change to bear children. The constant change of a monthly cycle for one thing, and then the bigger changes needed to accommodate a growing child. Rosalie's body couldn't change. It just needles me the wrong way. And then she goes on to say, Bella, I never really understood Rosalie's pain and resentment before. I never imagined myself a mother, never wanted that. It had been a piece of cake to promise Edward that I didn't care about giving up children for him, because I truly didn't. Children in the abstract had never appealed to me. They seemed to be loud creatures, often dripping some form of goo. I never had much to do with them. When I dreamed of Renee providing me with a brother, I'd always imagined an older brother, someone to take care of me rather than the other way around. This child, Edward's child, was a totally different story. I wanted him like I wanted air to breathe, not a choice, a necessity. Then the fact that Edward is against the child because it's literally killing Bella until he can hear the baby's thoughts, and that makes him realize that it's not an it's a baby. But the biggest issue I have with the pregnancy choice is that we spend the entirety of Bella's pregnancy in Jacob's point of view. And so we see the bond instantly from her perspective, but we don't get any insight into why she's feeling this way, any of her doubts, any of her concerns. As soon as she becomes pregnant, she becomes the entirely martyred mother archetype with no care or concern for herself, just this wild optimism that everything is going to be okay. And when I understand for people who have dealt with fertility issues that this might seem like a really good storyline, and I'm not going to poo-poo that, what I will say is that taking a critical lens at this storyline, it is showing how Bella is performing the right kind of womanhood, the right kind of femininity by getting to be a mother. And mind you, she doesn't want a child. She wants Edward's child. And when Renesmee is born, she's born essentially not needing to be parented. She is going to go from baby to child in 7 years. She is never going to actually have to worry about raising this child. She can just pass her off to other people. She gets to have a child because she needs to have one to be a woman, but the care of the child doesn't need to be her priority because the child is special. And then Jacob imprints on the baby, and it kind of all just goes tits up from there. She gets to lean in so hard that she becomes a super vampire, and with imprinting, now Jacob gets to be her son-in-law. She doesn't have to lose her best friend. She gains a son-in-law when he marries her 7-year-old, which is fucked. And I can't believe that actually happened in a text made for teenagers. I mean, Renesmee comes into being with a soulmate already ready for her, a soulmate that assaulted her mother multiple times. When so much about monster fiction is queer and subversive and alternative, and what Stephenie Meyer did without meaning to is really usher this idea of hyper conservative monstery, and I just find it very disconcerting. And not to say that there aren't other characters in other shows that are heteronormative, but even if you look at something like, The Vampire Diaries is more queer than this, and The Vampire Diaries ain't that queer for shit, but it's more queer than this. And even taking away all of that, it's boring. It's a boring endgame, not just because she's reached peak vampire teen trad wife mom, but because nothing feels earned. Meyer's Mormonism has been a huge part of the discourse around the series because of Mormonism ideology being in a lot of ways super conservative. There's a lot of race issues, especially having to deal with Black people and Indigenous people. I talk about this in my conservative vampire videos, but there is a discourse about feminism and Twilight from the Mormon perspective. Maxine Hanks's Do Mormon Moms Dream of Monstrous Gods, Stephenie Meyer's Twilight myth as Mormon heroine's journey. Twilight is a myth about true love, ideal love, and ultimate love. How love changes who you are. That it's a quest for self-fulfillment. The writer also brings up how Meyer's vampires and wolves are devoted monogamists. They mate forever via an imprinting of souls, much like Mormon's eternal marriage. She argues that Meyer is engaging in the feminist struggle for authentic self, and that the series ultimately is the hero's quest from a feminine perspective, a woman's metamorphosis from helpless to heroine. Meyer has done for the heroine what Tolkien and Lucas did for the hero. First of all, what an audacious statement to make. The feminine perspective meaning what? Even in Eclipse, where the big thing she does is sacrifice herself by cutting her hand to have some blood to save, I believe it's Seth, from a vampire. What happens in that? It turns out that Seth was faking it, and she never had to do that in the first place. So even in the text itself, where is she doing this heroism? In Breaking Dawn, where she's able to shield everyone with her mind shield powers, because of course she has powers as a vampire. That is the most heroic thing she can do, and it is an ability she happens to have out of luck of the draw. There's no reason for it. There's never any sort of rationale as to why she has this power. She just does. Even if you want to touch on Tolkien, who very much has a lot of Christian allegory in the work. You can't compare it. I'm sorry. There is nothing that Bella Swan does that even allows her to be even remotely compared to Mr. Baggins, okay? Mr. Frodo? Samwise Gamgee? Sorry, can't. Éowyn? Tolkien doesn't even have women in his books, but Éowyn herself, she killed the Witch King.
I am no man.
Let's stick to the rivers and lakes that we're used to. And I think what's interesting about this article, while I very much disagree with it, it gives an insight into what some people think feminism is. That they think it is really just the ability to do what you want, and context doesn't matter. Stephenie Meyer may consider herself a feminist, and her books may not be entirely in line with Mormon theology, but they are not ones that care about the political issues of women. Like, because Bella never has to deal with any of those things. She's a domestic character who wants to live a domestic passive life, and then she does. She doesn't have to go to school. She doesn't have to deal with the workforce. She doesn't have to worry about childcare. None of the things that would define a cis hetero woman's realities and conflicts she has to deal with. She doesn't have to cook. She doesn't have to clean. She doesn't have to do anything. She just gets to be this almost godlike being for free $99. And again, would I understand the appeal of that if the narrative were more engaging, if there were more plot, if there was more conflict? For sure. But there is none. Even the final battle is not a battle. They just talk. And then they're like, oh my God, it's not an immortal child? Okay, this is fine. Never mind. We're just gonna go away now. Deuces. Like, that's it. And if it wasn't bad enough, the series is racist too.
Jacob, put your clothes on.
Now, I'm not a Native person, so everything I'm saying is from the perspective of a Black reader. In the past, I wanted to make sure I wasn't speaking over Native voices who may like or enjoy Twilight, because you can enjoy something even if it's bad representation. And so I'm not speaking over voices of people who are in these communities that like Twilight. I simply feel it's important to address the very blatant things that are happening in this work, because everything about how Stephenie Meyer appropriated the Quileute culture and wrote the Native American characters in this series is deeply racist and problematic. And I think that even if you like it, there needs to be some acknowledgement that that is very much the reality. And in the end, the way that she writes Jacob and Quill and Emery and all of them is just really, really gross from top to bottom. And I'm really thankful that I was able to find at least one text that really discussed this, because I found a few, and a lot of them kind of like hover around the issue of talking about how like, oh, like, well, it has helped in terms of getting attention for the Quileute tribe. However, I think there's a deeper issue going on that was really done well in Natalie Wilson's Civilized Vampires versus Savage Werewolves, Race and Ethnicity in the Twilight series. Highly recommend, we'll link down below. The unfortunate reality is that the werewolf characters in Twilight are always constantly half naked, hypersexualized, adultified, and depicted as not being in control of their emotions with a tendency towards violence and sexism. Not to mention, imprinting turns two of them into groomers, which is basically this magical thing where they find their soulmate.
Like when you see her, everything changes. All of a sudden, it's not gravity holding you to the planet, it's her.
And I do not use that term lightly. In my Yashahime video on Nebula, I talked about why I don't necessarily like calling Sesshomaru a groomer in Yashahime, despite understanding why that allegation would happen. So when I say I don't use this term lightly, I mean it. How she writes the two characters who imprint on underage girls is disgusting on every single level. And when it comes to the racism in Twilight, when you read the book, even if you have a superficial knowledge of Native racism, so many things stand out. Their ability to shift is brought on by the fact that there are vampires in the community, which means that it's because of white vampires on their territory, they lose all autonomy of their bodies and are forced to shift to defend their land.
As more vampires set foot in their territory, more Quileutes turned, their nature compelling them to join the pack.
Hey, easy there. Hey, it's all right. You're gonna be okay.
Shifting is also what triggers the potential for them to imprint, therefore meaning that their ability to choose their romantic relationships is also taken away by the shifting, by becoming these creatures, which is triggered by the white vampires coming in. So, red flag number one. Meyer also tries really, really hard to sell imprinting as a non-sexual thing. And even in the illustrated guide, they emphasize that whatever age the person that they imprint on is, the person who does the imprinting will be whatever they want them to be. And my whole thing is, well, what if they want them to fuck off? When Jacob explains that Quill has imprinted on a 2-year-old and it's okay because he'll just be her friend, the idea is he's going to be whatever she will want, so why wouldn't she want to be with anyone else? that is grooming. He will essentially be spending almost every moment possible he can with this child from the age of 2 to adulthood. And the way they talk about it is extremely gross. This is taken directly from Breaking Dawn. I'd seen Quill play peekaboo for an hour straight without getting bored, and I couldn't even make fun of him for it. I envied him too much. This is Jacob's point of view. Deplorable. Though I did think it sucked he had a good 14 years of monkitude ahead of him until Claire was his age. For Quill at least, it was a good thing werewolves didn't get older. But even all that time didn't seem to bother him. Horrible. That's supposed to be a good thing. And then there's also a gay joke right after, because when Jacob's talking to Quill, Quill says, I don't notice girls anymore, you know, I don't see their faces. And Jacob goes, put that together with the tiara and makeup, and maybe Claire will have a different kind of competition. It's like, yeah, gay jokes. It's great. So fucking great. I also can't imagine, you know, being okay with having a sudden attraction to a toddler, and there's no amount of like hand-wringing about, well, she's not really a teenager, or like, it's not sexual. But the intent is to marry them. The intent is to have children with them. It's also key to know that in the illustrated guide, it says that it's an opposite sex thing. In this world, you cannot be a gay werewolf, or you're lying about it, because you wouldn't be able to imprint on another person who is the same sex as you. Of every character in the tribe, Jacob is the only one not to imprint on someone who is native. And I feel like this is all just a way to cement Jacob to this white family for all eternity. A family that calls him a dog and a mongrel for almost the entire series. It is deeply uncomfortable. In the final book of the series, Breaking Dawn, this view, the assimilation of the native characters, is further promoted when the Cullens introduce culture to Jacob, inviting him into their home. Sleeping and eating outside at first in various states of undress, he is gradually civilized and moves inside the house or into the white world. Esme feeds and clothes the wayward wolf boy, offering him shelter and sustenance. Throughout the book, Jacob's good side is brave, dedicated, protective, and loyal. His bad side is temperamental, vindictive, violent, and undomesticated. There's so much focus on Jacob's nudity, and before Jacob becomes a werewolf, he calls them a cult and about how they're all about our land and tribe pride. So before he becomes a werewolf, shifter, whatever, he's much more like, yeah, whatever, culture. And then afterwards he gets 10 toes down, and that creates conflict between him and Bella and the Cullens. And so him being with Renesmee essentially allows him this entry point into the white world that he couldn't have with Bella. And I think what's so uncomfortable is, like, from like New Moon on, he is always pushing himself onto Bella. He assaults her multiple times. He lies about trying to commit suicide in Eclipse so that they'll kiss. Forces a kiss on her, and she punches him and breaks her hand. And Charlie says, "Well done."
Total misunderstanding.
You know, a rare Charlie L. And I'm just sitting here like, this is really disturbing to have one of the most well-known native characters in all of young adult be this hypersexual, adultified teenager who goes from looking 17, 16 to be able to pass for 27 years old. And I think about that, I'm just like, that's really disturbing. But the reason why it's allowed to happen is because Jacob is written in a way where he has no culture. If you didn't know that the Quileutes were an actual tribe or anything like that, you could just assume he was a white kid, because there's never any discussion about the reality, what it's like for him to live on the res, or there's never any sort of tension with the fact that he is a native boy who's in proximity with other white people. Even the way that the vampires and werewolves are set up is very racialized in context and just historically, but the text itself is trying to be so colorblind that it ignores all those things and just plays into it even more, because it's uncomfortable to have this white family call Jacob a brown character, a mongrel, and a dog. Like at one point they give him a dog bowl. And it's like, it's meant to just be dog jokes, but the idea that there's a racial element to that is completely like going over the heads of even Stephenie Meyer herself. And it's absorbed passively, and I think it's illustrated really well in the conclusion to this article. Twilight relies on stereotypical representations of race focuses on falsified legends and leaves out any consideration of the lasting effects of colonization. While the texts are indeed fictional, we cannot discount the power such fiction holds over our lives, over the socialization of young readers, and we need to, even as fans, be critical about some of the most delimiting messages the series offers about race. So I've been doing this thing where I write my conclusions after I finish the video to see if there was anything that I missed or if there's something that I wish I had touched on more in the video. And having gone through and finally finished editing this one, I do wish I had spent a little bit more time discussing Edward and the hyper-masculinity that he does have in the series. I think he's just such a boring character that it's also just dull sometimes. What I think is interesting, especially in the context of how Jacob is hypersexualized as a native character, is that with Edward there's always this idea that he is this classical, sublime, godly beauty, whereas Jacob's attraction is very raw in that kind of sense. And I think the biggest thing you can tell from the switch between Twilight to New Moon is that there is a moment in Twilight for a while where you do kind of feel like there is some sexual intimidation that Edward does possess. It goes away as soon as the meadow scene happens, but it is interesting but then it all gets transferred onto Jacob and remains there for the entirety of the series. I also wanted to emphasize that Bella's choices are not really choices because of how the text writes her. I think it's very important that even though she says that she's never fit in and she doesn't really, match other people, the first thing you see when you read Twilight is her going to a new town and everyone fawning over her, multiple guys trying to date her. You never see that she is an outsider. You are told that because she's not, blonde and tan. I can relate to not being blonde, but there is never at any point where you get a legitimate idea that Bella is someone who feels out of step in society. Like being clumsy and being somewhat socially awkward on the page and feeling like you're smarter than your peers is not the same as feeling as though you've never fit in, or the idea that you have to raise yourself. I think all of those things are told to us, but they are never probably examined in the text. I think that there is something interesting about the idea of a teenager choosing to become a vampire. I just don't think that anything interesting is done with it. Again, it feels very much heteronormative, heterosexual wish fulfillment that has been transposed into a queer genre and just going with that. However, my big thing I wanted to make sure that I clarified in this ending portion is that none of this is done with the intent to gatekeep works. It is simply to push people to explore beyond the superficial when it comes to these kinds of texts. I read everything. Like right now on my reading shelf, I'm reading Canadian Boyfriend by Jenny Holiday because the male love interest is a widow and a single dad, and I thought that's neat. I'm reading Star Wars Splinter of the Mind's Eye because I saw a really good TikTok about it, and I thought I want to read this weird AU canon. I'm also reading Runaway Horses by Yukio Mishima because I started reading the first one, I finished it, and reading the books makes me think of someone I care about, so I'm just enjoying reading those. So I read everything. Like, I am not saying that there is something inherently wrong with any of this. What I do feel is that if we're going to stand 10 toes down in the reality that we think that works written by women that are directly for people who are marginalized, gendered, that it doesn't get seen as literary. And we're fighting against that, which I think any of us who love books across multiple genres agree with. Then you also have to learn to be okay with it being treated with the same kind of literary criticism that any other text would be. And I know that it doesn't always feel that way because there is so much attention given to works that femmes and women like. However, that does not mean there isn't something to be examined. These are books that are shaping the industry. I mentioned Sarah J. Maas earlier, and when I was working on this video in my downtime, was scrolling the subreddit. And I think there is this dual nature to treat all criticism as if it's in bad faith or by haters, and that's not true. And I feel like those narratives push people out. And again, we can disagree. I'm one black voice. I'm sure there will be a black person in the comments who loves ACOTAR, didn't see anything wrong with the Breonna Taylor post, and we can talk about that. We can have a discussion. But I don't feel like my opinion needs to be shut down so that you can enjoy ACOTAR. Discussing how an author reacts to systematic violence is more important than just being able to just enjoy ACOTAR. Like, that's just a reality situation. And being aware of the criticism about a book that you like is important in spreading that book around. I love Dune. I'm planning on doing a big reread of it at the end of the year, hopefully when I have things to celebrate, and I love it. But right now, it is rightfully being dragged by Middle Eastern, Arabic, and North African people online because there is a lot for it to be dragged in. I think that the Orientalism in the book definitely has problematic issues. It isn't helped that the adaptation has chosen time and time again not to hire the actors whose culture inspired the text, and therefore the dragging has commenced. And because I love Dune, because I have read, academic literature studies about Dune, I can engage with it on multiple levels. I can argue why I think it does certain things correctly, but I also understand why people don't think it did so. And that's how you have an engaging conversation. That's how you build community among difference. And I think it's so important to back away from this instinct of treating people who are pushing back against your passive wish fulfillment as trying to do intentional harm. Because I don't think a lot of people really truly sit and understand the ways in which other people are not allowed entry into said wish fulfillment, and how comfortable some people have gotten being the face of this and having everyone being behind them. Like I said before, there was a lot to examine about the misogyny surrounding Twilight, especially directed towards Stephenie Meyer. However, it doesn't mean that she herself create a series of books that's infallible. And I understand that with the era of J.K. Rowling being a horrible racist white supremacist transphobe, that there's a desire to be like, oh, well, look at this other thing that people thought was problematic. Is it actually better? It's not. And I know that a lot of people like to use death of the author, and I don't subscribe to that piece of criticism, because I find for myself that looking at the context of what a writer feels and is like is important to understand their values and what they're putting into the text. It's important to add certain layers to it. And I think it's also important when you're trying to dispel misinformation. I'm working on a video right now, just starting to highlight it, about Tolkien and race. And so the suggestion of Lindsay Ellis, I ended up getting a copy of the collection of his letters so I can actually read and see how he has spoken about race in his life, to get a better understanding of what he actually said and thought, and not just take things through the grapevine. So many agents of white supremacy and homophobia and sexism and misogynoir really enjoy trying to say that all of these writers who are beloved are inherently on their side, apropos of nothing, but because they assume that a lot of these, writers inherently side with them. And it's important to fight back against that. And the only way you can do so is with knowledge. And so this video is not to say that you can't enjoy Twilight. There are plenty of people in my life who are brilliant people who enjoy Twilight, and we kiki about it all the time. My friend sent me a shirt of Jacob that says, "I got that dog in me," and I was like, that is flavorful. I do enjoy that. The casting of Taylor Lautner is a whole other conversation, but I'm not gonna get into that. I'm gonna let the natives actually speak on that themselves. Even the ColourPop makeup line that I shaded, some of them shits is cute. That lip gloss, I was like, that's very flavorful. The glitter, it's very good packaging. It's very good. It's just about being aware of what we're consuming and not treating awareness as a threat to enjoyment. There are plenty of ways to blend both. And I think that if you really want to be in community with other people, you have to learn how to do that. Otherwise, you might as well just be reading by yourself.